It began with a forgotten toy, a relic of a bygone era resting on a dusty auction block in Chicago. The date was November 14th, 2011. The air in the room was thick, with the scent of old paper and polished wood, a low murmur of bids rising and falling like a tide. For Owen Hayes, a 30-year-old industrial designer with a reverence for the past, none of the other lots mattered. His eyes were fixed on a single item, the Sparky prototype, a one-of-a-kind tin-plate robot from a master craftsman. He had grown up idolizing the creations of Walter Sterling, and this was a holy grail. When the auctioneer's gavel finally fell, sealing his winning bid of $2,500, a quiet thrill ran through him. He had just purchased a piece of his childhood hero's legacy, unaware he had also acquired the key to a 19-year-old mystery. Back in his workshop, a meticulously organized space that was part museum and part laboratory, Owen placed the robot on his steel workbench. The room was a sanctuary, a testament to his passion. Shelves were lined with vintage toys, each one a marvel of mechanics and imagination from a time before microchips dominated play. Tools hung in perfect order, from delicate calipers to heavy-duty sanders. Owen wasn't just a collector. He was a restorer, a student of the art form. He believed every gear, every spring, every painted smile held a story. Sparky sat under the bright task light, its metal shell gleaming faintly. For Owen, this wasn't about the monetary value. It was about connecting with the mind of its creator, the legendary Walter Sterling, a man who had vanished from the world almost 2 decades ago. He examined the prototype with a practiced eye, his fingers tracing the seams of the pressed tin. Sparky was a marvel of analog design, standing about 18 inches tall. Its body was painted a cheerful cherry red, with bright yellow arms and legs. The face was a simple, optimistic design, 2 round eyes and a friendly, painted-on smile. Yet it were the subtle details that spoke of Sterling's genius, the articulated joints, the intricate gear housing visible through a small plastic window in its chest, the sheer weight and solidity of it. This was not a mass-produced plaything. It was a hand-crafted piece of art. It represented the pinnacle of Sterling's work, a final, silent testament to a career that had defined a generation of childhoods, including Owen's own, before it was inexplicably cut short. The story of that ending began 19 years earlier, on a cold and snowy Christmas Eve in 1992. Walter Sterling's workshop wasn't silent then. It was a vibrant symphony of creation. The air hummed with the sound of lathes and drills, scented with hot plastic and ozone from a soldering iron. Walter, a man with a wild shock of graying hair and eyes that sparkled with relentless energy, was hunched over this very same robot. He was the Willy Wonka of his time, a visionary who saw toys not as mere products, but as vessels for wonder. He was on the verge of announcing a new line that would revolutionize the industry. His family was waiting for him at home. The Christmas tree was lit. But Walter never made it home for the holiday. On December 23, 1992, Walter Sterling, the king of toys, a beloved Chicago icon, walked out of his workshop to meet his business partner and vanished into the winter night. The initial investigation was massive, capturing the city's attention. Police searched, volunteers scoured parks, and newspapers ran his smiling face on the front page for weeks. But there were no signs of a struggle, no ransom note, no body. Eventually, the official narrative settled on a tragic but simple explanation: abandonment. The pressure of his empire, they said, had become too much. He had walked away from his company, his family, and his life. The case went cold, and Walter Sterling faded from headlines into the realm of urban legend, a cautionary tale of genius and burnout. 19 years later, in the quiet of his workshop, Owen Hayes was blissfully unaware of the dark history he held in his hands. His focus was singular and technical. He wanted to bring Sparky to life. He noticed the battery compartment on the robot's back was sealed shut with a film of rust and corrosion, a common problem for old toys left in storage. It was a simple challenge for a man of his skills. With the delicacy of a surgeon, he selected a set of fine-tipped tools. His goal was straightforward: open the compartment, clean the contacts, insert fresh batteries, and hopefully see the robot's eyes light up or hear the faint whir of its internal clockwork. It was a ritual of restoration, a quiet communion between him and the Creator. With a final gentle twist of a micro lever, the corroded panel popped free. Owen smiled in satisfaction. He peered inside, expecting to see the familiar sight of decayed D-cell batteries. Instead, he saw them, crumbling and leaking a chalky residue. But beneath them, nestled deep within the cavity, was something else entirely. It was a small, dark object, roughly the size of a matchbox, that had no place in the robot's design. It was a miniature cassette recorder, a primitive piece of technology, even for 1992. Its presence was an anomaly, a detail so out of place it felt like a deliberate secret. Why would Walter Sterling hide a recording device inside the power source of his final masterpiece? The question hung in the silent workshop. Owen's breath hitched. A wave of confusion and intrigue washed over him. This changed everything. This wasn't a simple restoration anymore. Using a pair of tweezers, he carefully lifted the small recorder from its nest. The plastic casing was brittle with age. He could see the thin, brown ribbon of magnetic tape coiled around two tiny spools. It was a relic, a piece of spycraft from a different time. On its side, he found a minuscule playback button, barely visible to the naked eye. His heart began to pound against his ribs, a steady drumbeat in the quiet room. This device was not an accident. It was planted. It was hidden. A surge of adrenaline shot through him as his thumb moved towards the button, compelled by a mystery he didn't yet understand. He pressed down. A soft click echoed in the workshop, followed by the faint, mechanical hiss of aging tape. For a moment, there was only static. Then, a voice emerged from the tiny, tinny speaker, a voice filled with passion and anger. Owen froze, the tool in his other hand clattering onto the workbench. He recognized that voice instantly from old television interviews. It was Walter Sterling. His voice was alive, arguing. Then a second voice answered, this one colder, laced with a chilling pragmatism. An argument about patents, about ownership, about betrayal. Owen leaned closer, his ear almost touching the device, as the second voice delivered a final, terrifying sentence that cut through the decades. This technology isn't leaving this workshop, and neither are you. The tinny hiss of the tape gave way to an abrupt, profound silence. Owen remained perfectly still, his body frozen in a posture of intense focus, his ear still inclined toward the tiny recorder. The air in his workshop, once a comforting space of creativity and nostalgia, now felt heavy and cold, thick with the ghost of a 19-year-old confrontation. The cheerful, cherry-red robot on the workbench seemed to mock him with its painted-on smile, a grotesque juxtaposition to the chilling finality of the words that had just echoed from its metallic shell. The sentence, asterisk, and neither are you, asterisk, replayed in his mind, a venomous whisper that had traveled through time. His fingers, numb with shock, lost their grip, and a small screwdriver clattered onto the steel table, the sharp sound shattering the oppressive quiet, like a gunshot. A wave of icy dread washed over him, a physical sensation that started in the pit of his stomach and spread through his limbs, leaving him feeling weak and exposed. This wasn't a hidden Easter egg left by a playful creator. It was a testament, a final, desperate recording of a man facing his end. He stared at Sparky, the object of his collector's desire, and saw it for what it truly was, not a toy, but a witness. A silent, metal sarcophagus holding the last moments of Walter Sterling's life. The joy of his acquisition curdled into horror. He had sought a connection to his childhood hero, and in a cruel twist of fate, he had found it, not in the genius of the robot's mechanics, but in the raw terror of its creator's last breath. His mind, usually so methodical and calm, raced in a chaotic spiral. Who was that second voice? The cold, pragmatic tone was devoid of emotion, the voice of someone making a calculated business decision that just happened to involve a human life. The argument over patents and technology suddenly clicked into place. painting a grim picture of corporate greed and betrayal. The official story, that Walter Sterling, the Willy Wonka of his generation, had simply walked away from it all, crumbled into dust. This recording didn't suggest a man succumbing to pressure. It captured a man fighting for his life's work, for his very existence, against an unseen and ruthless adversary. The legend of the burnt-out genius was a lie, a carefully constructed narrative to hide a much darker truth. With a hand that trembled almost imperceptibly, Owen carefully lifted the microcassette recorder and placed it on a clean, soft cloth on his workbench. He treated it with the reverence of a holy relic, a fragile artifact that held the key to everything. The entire atmosphere of his sanctuary had shifted. The neatly arranged tools, the vintage toy soldiers standing at attention on the shelves, the blueprints tacked to the wall, they all seemed to be part of a different life, a life that had existed only moments before he pressed that tiny button. His workshop was no longer just his space. It felt like a crime scene, contaminated by a decades-old act of violence that had suddenly, shockingly, become his problem. He was now inextricably linked to the fate of Walter Sterling. An immediate, powerful urge to act surged through him, but it was quickly tempered by a paralyzing sense of uncertainty. What was his next move? Call the Chicago police? He could already hear the weary skepticism in the desk sergeant's voice as he tried to explain how a 19-year-old toy robot held the evidence to a cold case. You found a what? Inside a what? They would ask, likely dismissing him as a crank or a conspiracy theorist. He needed more than just a scratchy, tinny recording. He needed proof, he needed context, he needed to understand the full scope of what he had just unearthed before he could bring it into the light. To act rashly would be to risk having the single most important clue in this mystery dismissed and buried all over again. Using the delicate tip of a jeweler's screwdriver, he carefully rewound the fragile magnetic tape, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. He had to hear it again, to dissect every nuance, every background sound, every flicker of emotion in the voices. He pressed play, and the chilling dialogue filled the room once more. This time he focused past the initial shock. He heard the passion and desperation in Walter Sterling's voice as he argued about protecting his invention. And he heard the chilling, unwavering resolve in the other man's tone, a voice that was not angry, but terrifyingly calm, as if discussing a routine business transaction. Owen realized he was performing a kind of forensic autopsy on a conversation, listening to the final, fading heartbeat of a man's life. The full weight of his discovery began to settle upon his shoulders, a heavy mantle of responsibility he had never asked for. This was no longer about restoring a vintage toy or owning a piece of history. This was about justice. He, Owen Hayes, a quiet industrial designer who preferred the company of gears and schematics to people, was now the sole custodian of a dead man's last words. The admiration he had always felt for Walter Sterling transformed into a profound, almost personal sense of duty. He felt as if Sterling himself had reached out from the past, entrusting him with this final, desperate message. It was a silent pact made across the years, a plea for the truth to finally be heard. He swiveled in his chair and turned to his computer, his fingers moving with newfound purpose across the keyboard. He typed Walter Sterling disappearance into the search bar, and a flood of information filled the screen. He bypassed the recent collector forums and went straight to the source. Archived news articles from the Chicago Tribune and Sun-Times, dated late December 1992 and early 1993. The headlines were a stark reminder of the official narrative. Toy magnate vanishes before Christmas. Police suspect Sterling walked away from life. Family's heartbreak. He devoured the articles, his eyes scanning for names, for details, for anything that might connect to the voice on the tape. And then he found it, a name repeated in nearly every story. Preston Blackwell, Walter Sterling's business partner. The man who had stepped in to save the company after his friend's tragic and inexplicable departure. The articles were filled with quotes from Blackwell, expressing his profound shock and sadness. He spoke of Walter as a brilliant but troubled soul, hinting that the pressures of running a toy empire had become too much for him to bear. Blackwell had masterfully crafted the narrative of a voluntary abandonment. But as Owen stared at a grainy black-and-white photo of a younger Preston Blackwell shaking hands with Walter Sterling, he felt a cold certainty. The smooth, charismatic face in the photograph belonged to the cold, ruthless voice on the tape. The implicit promise of his journey became terrifyingly clear. Sparky was the Rosetta Stone for a 19-year-old murder. Owen's quiet, ordered life of restoration and design had been irrevocably shattered. He was standing at the threshold of a dark and dangerous story, one that had been successfully buried for nearly 2 decades under layers of lies and corporate success. He was not a detective. He had no training, no authority, no resources beyond his own intellect and determination. But he had the one thing that had been missing for all these years: the truth, captured on a tiny spool of tape hidden inside a tin plate robot. He was now a player in a game he didn't understand, against an opponent who had already proven he would do anything to win. His gaze returned to the robot sitting on his workbench. Its cheerful, painted eyes stared back at him, a silent challenge. In that moment, Owen Hayes made a decision. He would not turn away. He would not hand this off and hope for the best. He would follow this path wherever it led, no matter how dark. He owed it to the memory of the man who had inspired his life's passion. Walter Sterling's voice had been silenced on a cold winter's night, but now, after 19 years of darkness, it had found a new vessel. Owen would become his voice. He would uncover what really happened on December 23, 1992, and ensure that the man responsible would finally face the consequences of the secret Sparky had guarded for so long. But this was just the beginning of what was to come. What would you do in a situation like this? You find a piece of history, a clue to a potential crime. Do you turn it in? Or do you dig deeper yourself? Do you think you could handle the weight of a secret that's been buried for almost 20 years? Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you're as hooked as I am, please do me a huge favor. Hit that like button, share this with someone who loves a good mystery, and make sure you subscribe and turn on all notifications. You won't want to miss what happens next. To understand the silence Sparky held for 19 years, you must first understand the symphony it was born from. In 1992, Walter Sterling was not just a toy maker. To understand the silence Sparky held for 19 years, you must first understand the symphony it was born from. In 1992, Walter Sterling was not just a toy maker. He was the city's resident magician, a beloved Chicago icon whose factory, Sterling Toys, was less a place of industry and more a modern-day Santa's workshop. The building, a sprawling brick complex on the city's industrial west side, was famous for the whimsical clockwork figures that performed in its windows. Walter, with his untamed silver hair and paint-stained fingers, was the heart of it all. He believed toys were not mere commodities, but instruments of joy, and his workshop was a testament to that philosophy. It was a chaotic wonderland of whirring lathes, bubbling beakers, and half-finished creations that seemed to hold a life of their own, each one a fragment of his boundless imagination waiting to be brought into the world. Standing in stark contrast to Walter's creative chaos was his partner, Preston Blackwell. Where Walter saw magic, Preston saw market share. He was the impeccably dressed, silver-tongued businessman who had transformed Walter's genius into a commercial empire. Publicly, they were the perfect duo, the artist and the strategist. Blackwell handled the boardrooms, the patents, and the multi-million-dollar distribution deals that Walter found tedious. He smoothed over the creator's eccentricities and presented a polished, corporate face to the world. Behind the scenes, however, a quiet friction had been growing. Blackwell's ambition was limitless, and he was beginning to view Walter's artistic integrity not as the company's greatest asset, but as its most significant obstacle to true global domination. Their partnership, once a perfect synergy, was slowly becoming a battle of opposing philosophies. The true center of Walter Sterling's universe, however, was not his workshop, but his 10-year-old daughter, Clara. For her, he wasn't a famous inventor. He was simply Dad, the man who could build miniature carousels out of spare parts and make toy soldiers march with an almost eerie precision. He reserved his greatest creations for her. Their home in a quiet Oak Park suburb was a private museum of one-of-a-kind wonders. Clara grew up believing in a world where anything was possible, because her father made it so. The winter of 1992 was meant to be the most magical yet. She knew he was working on something extraordinary, a special Christmas surprise he called his masterpiece. She would often visit the workshop, her small hand in his, watching in awe as he brought metal and plastic to life, completely unaware of the darkness gathering at the edges of her father's brilliant world. That masterpiece was the cornerstone of a revolutionary new toy line set to be unveiled in the new year. Sterling Toys was at a critical juncture, facing fierce competition from emerging electronic toys and video games. Walter, a staunch traditionalist who championed analog mechanics, knew he needed something groundbreaking to secure his company's future. The industry was buzzing with rumors about what he was creating, and the pressure was immense. Blackwell had secured massive advance orders based on pure speculation, leveraging Walter's reputation to its absolute limit. The success of this new line wasn't just about profit, it was about legacy. It was Walter's chance to prove that true wonder didn't need a microchip, and for Blackwell, it was the key to unlocking a fortune far beyond anything they had ever imagined. At the heart of this new line was Sparky. To the casual observer, it was a charmingly retro tin plate robot, a nostalgic nod to the toys of a bygone era. But it was so much more. Walter had poured years of research and countless sleepless nights into the prototype. It contained a complex system of gyroscopes and internal balances that gave it a fluidity of movement unheard of in a mechanical toy. It wasn't just a product, it was a breakthrough. He spoke of it with a feverish passion, telling Clara it would be the smartest toy ever made, without a single circuit board. He saw it as the pinnacle of his art form, the perfect fusion of mechanics and personality. But Blackwell saw something else entirely. He saw an application far beyond the toy aisle, a technology with military and aerospace potential worth billions. The arguments in the workshop became more frequent in the fall of 1992. Employees would hear raised voices from behind the closed doors of Walter's private design studio. The words were often muffled, but the themes were clear: patents, ownership, licensing, and betrayal. Walter, fiercely protective of his creation, wanted to keep the technology within the world of toys, a source of joy for children. Blackwell, seeing a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, was pushing aggressively to sell the core technology to the highest bidder, whether that was a defense contractor or a rival tech firm. Their fundamental disagreement had reached a breaking point. Walter was fighting to protect the soul of his invention, while Blackwell was determined to exploit its body for an astronomical sum, setting the stage for a final, fateful confrontation. On the morning of December 23, 1992, Chicago was a picturesque winter wonderland. A thick blanket of fresh snow covered the city, muffling the usual urban clamor and creating a sense of serene anticipation for the coming holiday. Christmas lights twinkled on every lamppost, and the air was crisp and cold. At the Sterling home, the tree was decorated, presents were wrapped, and the scent of baking cookies filled the air. Clara and her mother were preparing for their annual Christmas Eve tradition, waiting for Walter to return from the workshop for one last meeting before the holiday break. The atmosphere was one of domestic warmth and festive cheer, a perfect, peaceful bubble that was about to be shattered by an act of unimaginable greed and violence, leaving a wound that would fester for nearly 2 decades. In his workshop, Walter Sterling was putting the final touches on the Sparky prototype. He worked with a focused intensity, a small smile playing on his lips. He had done it. Against all odds, he had perfected his vision. The robot stood on his workbench, a gleaming red and yellow testament to his genius. He believed he had found a way to protect his invention, a legal maneuver that would safeguard its use for the toy company alone. His final meeting with Blackwell that evening was meant to be a declaration of that victory. When the phone rang, he answered it with a sense of relief, ready to finally put the conflict behind him and go home to his family. He walked out of his workshop and into the swirling snow of the winter night, leaving Sparky behind on the bench, a silent, unknowing guardian of his last moments. For 3 days, the recording played on a loop in Owen's mind, a ghostly echo in the quiet of his workshop. The weight of the secret was a physical presence, pressing down on him, making the familiar comfort of his workspace feel like a cage. He knew he couldn't go to the police, not yet. A tinny recording from a toy robot was circumstantial at best, insane at worst. He needed more. He needed a human connection to the voice on the tape. He needed Clara Sterling. His search began online, sifting through public records and professional directories with the same meticulous focus he usually reserved for sourcing rare parts. He found her listed as a partner in a high-end architectural firm in downtown Chicago. Her digital footprint was minimal, professional, and detached. He found an address, a sleek, modern glass and steel high-rise that couldn't be more different from the world of gears and tin her father had inhabited. The drive downtown was surreal. The Sparky prototype, carefully wrapped in a soft cloth, sat on the passenger seat. It felt less like a toy and more like a bomb, a relic containing a truth powerful enough to shatter lives. Owen parked across the street from her building, the imposing structure reflecting the cold November sky. For nearly an hour he just sat there, rehearsing introductions in his head, each one sounding more absurd than the last. How do you tell a stranger that you believe her father, a man the world thinks abandoned her, was actually murdered? How do you explain that your only proof is a voice trapped inside the very symbol of his last days on Earth? He felt like an intruder, a grave robber of memories, about to reopen a wound that had been left to scar over for 19 long years. Summoning a courage he didn't know he possessed, he crossed the street and entered the building's sterile lobby. The air smelled of clean steel and faint perfume. He found Clara Sterling's name on the directory and buzzed her apartment. Her voice through the intercom was exactly as he'd imagined, crisp, professional, and impatient. Yes? He stumbled through a vague explanation about a personal item belonging to her father. There was a long pause. He could hear the suspicion in the silence. Finally, she sighed. "I'll be down in the lobby in 5 minutes. Please don't waste my time." When she stepped out of the elevator, she was a study in controlled elegance, dressed in a sharp, dark pantsuit. But her eyes, guarded and weary, held the unmistakable shadow of a childhood trauma that had never truly faded. In the cold, echoing space of the lobby, under the watchful eye of a silent doorman, Owen gently unwrapped the robot. Clara's reaction was instantaneous and complex. A flicker of something, pain, nostalgia, recognition, crossed her face before being immediately suppressed by a wall of ice. "Sparky," she said, the name a dead thing on her lips. To her, this was not a treasured artifact. It was a monument to the lie that had shaped her existence. "Collectors find these things sometimes," she said, her voice flat and dismissive. "If you're looking for an appraisal, you've come to the wrong person." She turned to leave, her body language screaming her desire to escape this ghost from her past. Owen knew he had one chance, one shot to make her listen. He had to break through 19 years of carefully constructed defenses. "Please," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "You need to hear this." He pulled the micro-cassette recorder from his pocket. The tiny, archaic device looked absurdly out of place in her modern world. She stopped, her back still to him, rigid with tension. He pressed the play button. The hiss of the old tape filled the silence, and then it came. Walter Sterling's voice, alive with passion and frustration. Clara froze, her body going completely still. The sound, a voice she had only heard in dreams and fading memories for 2 decades, washed over her. Her shoulders began to tremble as the professional armor she wore disintegrated, revealing the raw, unhealed grief of the 10-year-old girl who had waited by the window for a father who never came home. Then came the second voice, cold and pragmatic. Clara slowly turned around, her face pale, her eyes wide with a dawning horror. She listened to the argument about patents, about ownership, about a future she never knew her father had been fighting for. And as Preston Blackwell delivered his final, chilling threat, a single, whispered word escaped her lips. Preston. It wasn't a question. It was a confirmation. A name that had been associated with sympathy and corporate stewardship in her life was now irrevocably tied to this act of ultimate betrayal. The official story of abandonment, the narrative that had been the bitter foundation of her life, crumbled into dust in the space of 30 seconds. Her father hadn't left her. He had been taken. The grief that had defined her for so long was instantly cauterized by a new, white-hot emotion, rage. The cynical architect vanished, replaced by a daughter whose father had just been murdered all over again, right here in this lobby. She looked at Owen, her eyes blazing with a fierce newfound purpose. The wall between them was gone, replaced by a shared, terrible knowledge. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice no longer dismissive but urgent, desperate. "Where did you get this? What else do you know?" In that moment, an unspoken pact was formed. They were no longer a collector and a victim's daughter. They were partners, bound by a dead man's voice and the sudden, violent weight of the truth. Their investigation had truly begun. Clara's mind, sharp and analytical from her architectural training, immediately began to process the implications. "A recording isn't enough," she stated, her voice shaking but resolute. "Preston owns half of this city. We'd be dismissed as lunatics." She began pacing the marble floor, her thoughts racing. "He always talked about the secrets inside his toys. He told me Sparky was special, that he had a surprise hidden inside." Her fragmented memories, once sources of pain, were now potential clues. They needed to legitimize their only piece of evidence. "I know someone," she said, stopping abruptly. "An audio engineer I went to school with. He does forensic work, restores old recordings for court cases. We need to know everything that's on that tape, every background noise, every nuance. We need proof that can't be denied." The audio engineer's studio was the antithesis of Owen's workshop. Located in a sterile, soundproofed suite in the River North neighborhood, it was a world of digital precision, not analog charm. The air smelled of clean electronics and recycled air. Ben Carter, the engineer, was a man in his late 20s with an intense, focused gaze and an almost surgical approach to his work. He greeted Clara with a brief, professional hug before turning his skeptical eyes on Owen and the ancient micro-cassette recorder he held. Ben's domain was filled with gleaming mixing boards, towering racks of digital processors, and monitors displaying complex audio waveforms. When Owen placed the tiny plastic recorder on the polished console, it looked like a fossil from a forgotten age, a piece of primitive technology that had washed up on the shore of a digital ocean. Clara's presence was the only thing that kept Ben from dismissing them outright. With the careful hands of a bomb disposal expert, Ben extracted the fragile brown ribbon of tape. "This is 19 years old," he warned, his voice low and serious. "The magnetic particles have likely degraded. The binder holding them to the tape is probably brittle. One wrong move, and it could turn to dust." He mounted the tiny spools onto a specialized machine designed for archival restoration, a complex apparatus of gentle guides and laser sensors that would digitize the recording with minimal physical stress. Owen and Clara stood behind him, their reflections staring back at them from the dark glass of the control room window. The silence in the soundproofed room was absolute, broken only by the soft whir of the machine. Every quiet click and whir felt monumental, as if they were listening to time itself being carefully unwound, second by agonizing second. Once digitized, Ben routed the raw audio through his massive studio speakers. The sound that filled the room was infinitely more powerful than the tiny hiss from the original recorder. Walter Sterling's voice, full of passion and righteous anger, was suddenly present, as if he were standing right there with them. Clara let out a small, choked gasp and instinctively took a step back, her hand flying to her mouth. The warmth and life in her father's voice, a sound she had longed to hear for 2 decades, was immediately followed by the cold, venomous pragmatism of Preston Blackwell. Hearing the final chilling threat, asterisk, "and neither are you," asterisk, boom through the studio with perfect clarity, was a physical blow. The color drained from Clara's face. All the years of forced cynicism and emotional armor were stripped away, leaving only the raw, visceral horror of hearing her father's final moments. Ben, unfazed by the emotional gravity of the content, switched to a professional, analytical mode. "Okay, let's clean this up," he said, his fingers flying across a keyboard. He began applying a series of digital filters, meticulously stripping away layers of tape hiss and ambient static. On a large monitor, he displayed the audio as a visual waveform, pointing out the distinct digital fingerprints of the two voices. "This is Sterling," he said, highlighting a vibrant, dynamic pattern. "And this is Blackwell. His vocal pattern is much more controlled, almost flat." He worked for nearly an hour, isolating frequencies, enhancing the dialogue, and transforming the ghostly echo into a crystal-clear piece of evidence. For Owen, watching the process was fascinating. It was the intersection of art and science, a digital seance bringing a crucial conversation back from the dead with undeniable precision and clarity. As he refined the audio, Ben paused, frowning at a persistent anomaly in the waveform. "There's something else here," he murmured, more to himself than to them. A low-frequency hum, deep in the background. He isolated the sound, looping a short segment. It was a rhythmic, intermittent buzzing, a sound that was clearly mechanical but not something Owen recognized. It was almost subliminal in the original recording, a ghost in the machine that had been hidden beneath the static for 19 years. Owen and Clara leaned closer to the console, their attention fixed on the screen as Ben fed the isolated sound signature into a vast audio effects library, searching for a match. The small, sterile room suddenly felt charged with a new kind of tension, the thrill of an unexpected discovery that could change everything they thought they knew. After several minutes of cross-referencing, the computer returned a positive match. Ben swiveled in his chair, his expression a mixture of surprise and professional satisfaction. "I'll be damned," he said. "It's a Miller Arcmaster 3000, an industrial welding machine. Very specific sound profile. They were top of the line for heavy fabrication back in the early 90s. He pulled up a file containing the machine's technical specifications and played a reference recording. The sound was identical. A cold dread began to form in Owen's stomach. A welding machine. The detail was so specific, so out of place. It was a piece of the puzzle that didn't fit, a factual anchor point in the chaos of the past. The argument between Walter and Preston hadn't just happened in an office. It had taken place near heavy industrial machinery. The words welding machine struck a deep, forgotten chord in Clara's memory, her eyes unfocused for a moment as an image surfaced from her childhood. "The prototype wing," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "My father had a special section of the workshop, sealed off from the rest. It's where he built the big mechanical displays, the ones for the windows. He had a huge welder in there. He called it his metal monster. He was the only one who ever used it." The memory was a sudden, brilliant flash of light in a dark room, connecting the forensic data to a real, physical space. It was a place she had been 100 times as a child, a place filled with the smell of hot metal and the bright, fizzing light of her father's creations. It was his inner sanctum. The final piece clicked into place with horrifying certainty. While Clara was lost in her memory, Owen was frantically pulling up documents on his tablet. He found a set of the original 1992 architectural blueprints for the Sterling Toys factory and overlaid them with a current satellite image of the massive Blackwell Toys corporate headquarters. His finger traced a path across the screen. The location of the old prototype wing, the sealed-off room with the unique welding machine that had hummed in the background of Walter Sterling's last recorded words, was now the precise location of the new building's central support column. It was buried under thousands of tons of concrete and steel. The sound on the tape was not just a clue, it was a tombstone. It marked a crime scene that had been deliberately and permanently entombed, hidden in plain sight at the very heart of Preston Blackwell's empire. The concrete reality of their discovery was a crushing weight, a paradox of victory and defeat that settled over them in the sterile silence of the audio studio. They now knew the where, but the location was a fortress, a crime scene buried beneath a monument to the very man who had committed the act. Walter Sterling's final moments were entombed at the heart of Blackwell Toys headquarters, a place as inaccessible as the moon. The triumph of finding the clue was immediately nullified by the impossibility of ever using it. Owen and Clara looked at each other, the same grim realization dawning in their eyes. Audio evidence and architectural blueprints were not enough. They couldn't dig through a skyscraper's foundation. They needed a human element, a living witness who could testify to what happened on that cold December night. Their quest had shifted from forensic archaeology to a desperate hunt for a ghost from the past. Clara, driven by a cold, methodical fury, threw herself into the task. Her architectural work was forgotten. This became her sole project. She unearthed her father's old, leather-bound address books and employee ledgers from a storage unit, the pages smelling of dust and faded memories. She spent hours cross-referencing names with public records, searching for anyone who was still around, anyone who might remember something. Meanwhile, Owen tackled the official side of the mystery, diving deep into the digital archives of the Chicago Police Department. He compiled every file, every report, every interview transcript from the original 1992 investigation. A single name appeared on nearly every document as the lead investigator, Detective David Miller. A subsequent search revealed Miller was now retired, living a quiet, solitary life in Evanston, a suburb just north of the city, seemingly a world away from the violence and secrets he once navigated. They found Detective Miller tending to a withered rose garden in his front yard, a man whose posture seemed permanently stooped by the weight of his past. When they introduced themselves, a flicker of recognition crossed his face at the name Sterling, quickly followed by a wall of cynical indifference. He invited them into a home that felt frozen in time, filled with the ghosts of solved and unsolved cases. He listened to their story with the weary patience of a man who had heard every conceivable theory. Blackwell was too smart, too connected, Miller said, his voice raspy with disuse. He crafted the perfect narrative. A troubled genius walks away. We had nothing to counter it. No witnesses, no forensic evidence, nothing. Let it go. Men like him build their empires on foundations you can't see, and you'll destroy yourselves trying to expose them. Owen knew this was his only chance to break through 19 years of hardened regret. He didn't bother with the tiny recorder. Instead, he took out his tablet, connected it to a small portable speaker, and played the pristine, digitally enhanced audio file Ben had created. The room filled with the vibrant, angry voice of Walter Sterling. Miller, who had been staring out the window, slowly turned his head, his body tensing. The clear, cold voice of Preston Blackwell followed, delivering the final, chilling threat. But it was the next sound that made the retired detective sit bolt upright in his chair, the distinct, intermittent hum of the Arcmaster 3000. Miller's eyes, once clouded with cynicism, sharpened with a focus that had been dormant for 2 decades. "I'll be damned," he whispered. "We never had a location." In that moment, the cold case was no longer cold. It was burning. A fire long thought extinguished was reignited within David Miller. He led them to his basement, a dusty archive of his career, and pulled out 2 large, cardboard boxes labeled Sterling W. He blew a thick layer of dust off the top and opened the flaps, revealing stacks of manila folders filled with witness statements, timelines, and crime scene photos of an empty workshop. "Blackwell had an alibi for the time of death, we estimated," Miller explained, his fingers tracing old notes. "But if the argument happened earlier, next to that welder..." He shuffled through a list of employees who worked the evening shift. His finger stopped on one name, Frank Rizzo, night security. His story was always too clean. Said he saw Sterling leave alone around 9 p.m., and Blackwell wasn't even on site. He was sweating bullets during the interview. I knew he was lying, but I couldn't break him. The hunt for Frank Rizzo became their singular focus. Miller, using the quiet network of retired police officers and old city contacts, began making calls. It was a slow, painstaking process of chasing down pension records and forwarding addresses. After 2 days of dead ends, he got a hit. Rizzo wasn't living in Chicago anymore. He was a resident at the St. Joseph's Care Facility in Joliet, his health in rapid decline. The news added a desperate urgency to their mission. They were no longer just seeking a witness. They were in a race against a biological clock. The 70-mile drive south on I-55 was a silent one, the air in the car thick, with a shared, unspoken anxiety. This man, this frail, elderly security guard, might be the only living person who could corroborate the story trapped on that magnetic tape. He was the key, and the key was fading. They found him in a small, antiseptic room that smelled of bleach and regret. Frank Rizzo was a shadow of a man, tethered to a hissing oxygen tank, his skin as thin and translucent as old paper. Miller began with the official questions, but Rizzo's eyes were filled with a familiar, decades-old terror, and he shook his head, mumbling denials. Then Clara stepped forward. She sat beside his bed, her voice soft. She didn't speak of murder or evidence. She spoke of her father, of the scent of sawdust and hot metal in the workshop, of the Christmas he never came home for. She showed him a small, faded photograph of herself as a 10-year-old girl, sitting on Walter Sterling's shoulders. That was what broke him. A lifetime of guilt finally overwhelmed his fear, and with a ragged sob, Frank Rizzo began to confess the truth. His story tumbled out, a torrent of words held back for 19 years. He told them about the bitter cold of that night, the swirling snow outside the workshop's large windows. He described seeing Preston Blackwell, long after all other employees had left, using a heavy-duty dolly to wheel a large, steel industrial tool chest out of the prototype wing. It was so heavy the dolly's wheels strained against the concrete floor. The next morning, just before his shift ended, Blackwell met him in the parking lot. He didn't threaten him. He simply handed him a thick manila envelope and said, "For your family's Christmas." Inside was $50,000 in cash. The unspoken message was clear. Walter Sterling left alone last night. You saw nothing else. The money, Rizzo wept, had paid for his house, but it had cost him his soul. While Miller worked with a notary to get Rizzo's confession officially signed and documented, the ripples from their discreet inquiries finally reached their destination. In his gleaming penthouse office atop the Blackwell Toys Tower, Preston Blackwell received a notification from his head of corporate security, a man whose job was to monitor for threats both internal and external. An old police file related to the 1992 Sterling case had been recently accessed by a retired detective. The daughter, Clara Sterling, had been making inquiries about former employees. A vintage toy collector had been seen with her. Blackwell stood at his floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the city he owned, a cold dread creeping into his veins. The foundation he had built his life upon, both literally and figuratively, felt infinitesimally less stable. The past was no longer buried. It was digging its way out. The first move was a subtle display of power. A black Lincoln Town car, sleek and menacing with tinted windows, began parking across the street from Owen's workshop at all hours. It never moved, but it was always there, a silent sentinel. Clara started receiving phone calls at her architectural firm, a blocked number that would ring twice and then hang up, 3 or 4 times a day. These weren't overt threats. They were messages. I see you. I know what you're doing. Stop. Blackwell was a master of psychological pressure, and he was applying it with surgical precision, expecting them to fracture, to retreat into fear. But he misjudged them. The intimidation didn't break their spirit. It forged it into steel. The abstract quest for justice was now a direct, personal battle against a very real and present danger. The escalation was swift and decisive. One evening, Owen returned to his workshop after meeting with Clara and Miller to find the high-security lock on his door compromised. It wasn't broken. It had been expertly picked. Inside, the space had been meticulously searched. His collection of vintage robots was slightly out of order, drawers were left ajar, and blueprints were unpinned from his corkboard. It was the work of professionals looking for something specific. He frantically checked on Sparky, who was still sitting on the workbench, untouched. Then he saw it. The small evidence bag containing the original microcassette recorder, which he had kept hidden in a drawer, was gone. They had left the robot but taken the voice. It was a chilling declaration from Blackwell. The game had changed from surveillance to suppression. He wasn't just watching them anymore. He was actively moving to silence the past for good. The break-in was a declaration. Owen stood in the center of his violated workshop, the quiet order of his life, shattered into a million pieces. The thieves had been surgical, professional. They hadn't come for his valuable collection or his tools. They had come for one thing only. The original microcassette was gone, but Sparky remained on the workbench, its painted smile a silent, mocking testament to the night's events. This wasn't a random burglary. It was a targeted strike from Preston Blackwell. It was a confirmation, more powerful than any confession, that the voice on that tape was real, and that Blackwell knew they had it. The subtle intimidation was over. The silent, parked cars and the phantom phone calls had been a prelude. Now, the war had begun, and Blackwell had just fired his first direct shot across the bow, making it terrifyingly clear that he was willing to do anything to keep his 19-year-old secret buried. They met in the sterile quiet of Clara's architectural office, a neutral ground far from Owen's compromised workshop. The theft of the original tape had changed the board entirely. "He left the robot," Owen said, his voice low and intense. He took the voice. Detective Miller, his face etched with a familiar, weary grimness, nodded slowly. "The physical artifact is gone, but we still have the digital copy. It's our most valuable asset now." He leaned forward, his gaze fixed on both of them. "You need to understand what you're up against. Blackwell didn't just get lucky in 1992. My investigation was stonewalled from the inside. Records went missing, witnesses changed their stories. He has deep roots in this city, possibly inside the department itself. Going to the authorities now isn't just a bad idea. It's like handing the executioner his axe. You can't trust anyone." Fueled by a cold, precise rage, Clara turned her focus from grief to finance. She began a deep dive into the labyrinth of Chicago's municipal archives, using her firm's high-level access to pull city planning records and corporate filings from 1993. She was looking for the ghost of her father's company, for any trace of the deal that had turned Sterling Toys into Blackwell Toys. After days of scouring microfilm and dusty ledgers, she found it, a pattern of anomalies. The construction permits for the new Blackwell headquarters, the very building that now stood on the site of her father's old workshop, had been fast-tracked through the city's notoriously slow zoning board in record time. More disturbingly, 3 key board members who signed off on the project had taken abrupt, well-funded early retirements within 6 months of the building's completion. It was the first concrete sign of a wider conspiracy. Back in his workshop, now secured with a new set of high-tech locks, Owen returned his attention to Sparky. The theft of the tape had recontextualized the robot. It wasn't just a witness, it was a vessel, a time capsule. Clara's faint memory of her father talking about secrets hidden inside his toys echoed in his mind. With the delicate precision of a surgeon, he began a complete disassembly. He carefully removed the tin plate limbs and prized open the main torso cavity, expecting to find only the intricate clockwork mechanisms he so admired. Instead, he found a thin metallic plate that didn't match the original design specifications. It was a false bottom. Prying it loose, his breath caught in his throat. Tucked inside was a small, tightly rolled cylinder of vellum schematics, preserved perfectly in the darkness for 19 years. The drawings were a language Owen barely understood. They were dense, complex, and filled with advanced physics equations that had nothing to do with making a toy walk or talk. The designs depicted a miniature, self-correcting gyroscopic stabilization system of breathtaking elegance and complexity. Realizing he was out of his depth, he photographed the schematics and took them to a former professor at the University of Chicago, an expert in mechanical engineering. The professor spread the images across his desk, his initial academic curiosity quickly turning to stunned disbelief. "This is impossible," he whispered, tracing a diagram with his finger. "For 1992? This is a form of inertial guidance technology that is decades ahead of its time. It's not for a toy, Owen. This is military grade. This is aerospace. This would have been worth a fortune." The motive for murder had just escalated exponentially. The revelation of the schematics cast Clara's financial research in a terrifying new light. She searched for patents related to gyroscopic technology filed by any of Blackwell's known corporate entities. The breakthrough came when she started investigating shell corporations. She found one, registered in Delaware in early 1993, that had filed a series of revolutionary patents under a generic, untraceable name. Cross-referencing the corporation's board members, she found the link, a lawyer who had sat on the Blackwell Toys board for over 20 years. This shell corporation had become Blackwell Aerospace, a secretive and immensely profitable subsidiary that supplied guidance systems to defense contractors. Preston Blackwell hadn't just stolen a toy company. He had stolen a world-changing invention and built a hidden billion-dollar empire on Walter Sterling's blood and genius. The $50,000 paid to Frank Rizzo was not hush money. It was a rounding error. In his penthouse office, Preston Blackwell was a man besieged by the past. The successful retrieval of the microcassette had brought him no peace, only confirmation that his fortress had been breached. His carefully constructed world, built on a single brutal act 19 years ago, was beginning to show cracks. Paranoia became his constant companion. He ordered sweeping digital security audits and had his most trusted executives covertly investigated. He knew Owen and Clara wouldn't stop. They had the scent of blood. He made a call he hadn't made in over a decade, to a man whose number was not stored in any phone. The man was a fixer, a specialist in making intractable problems disappear permanently. The conversation was chillingly brief. "The Sterling loose ends," Blackwell said. "Clean them up." The stakes had been raised from suppression to elimination. Detective Miller felt the chill long before the threat became overt. He received a call from a trusted friend, a deputy chief on the verge of retirement. The voice on the other end was strained, the words chosen with deliberate care. "David, I'm calling as a friend. Tell those people you're helping to stop digging. The old Sterling file has been flagged. From the top. Some very powerful people are getting agitated. This isn't just about a dead Toymaker anymore." Miller hung up the phone, a cold dread settling in his stomach. The corruption he had suspected in 1992 hadn't vanished. It had metastasized, weaving its tentacles deep into the city's power structure. They weren't just fighting a greedy CEO anymore. They had stumbled into a conspiracy, and the hornets were starting to swarm. Their lives were now in immediate and mortal danger. The weight of the danger began to press down on them, a suffocating, invisible force. Owen, a man who found comfort in solitude and the quiet logic of mechanics, now felt like a hunted animal. His workshop, his lifelong sanctuary, had become a cage, a place of constant vigilance. He found himself checking the new locks, jumping at unfamiliar sounds, the joy of his craft replaced by a gnawing anxiety. Clara, in turn, was haunted by the perversion of her father's dream. She saw his genius, his life's work, twisted from a source of childhood wonder into a tool for the military-industrial complex. This was no longer an abstract quest for justice against one evil man. It had become a deeply personal battle to reclaim her father's very soul from the corporate machine that had not only killed him, but had desecrated his legacy. They met again, not in an office or a workshop, but in the anonymous safety of a crowded university library. They were outgunned, outmaneuvered, and fighting an enemy whose influence seemed to permeate the very fabric of the city. The police were compromised. The legal system was a minefield. A direct confrontation was suicide. It was Miller who laid out their only remaining option, a strategy born of desperation. "We can't fight him in the shadows. That's his kingdom," the old detective said, his voice a low whisper. We have to drag him and his entire network into the light. Our only weapon is the truth. He looked from Owen to Clara, his eyes burning with a final, defiant spark. We leak everything. The digital audio, Rizzo's notarized confession, the aerospace schematics. We give it to someone Blackwell can't buy, bribe, or bury. Owen and Clara knew he was right. It was an all-or-nothing gambit, a final, desperate move to turn the tables. Miller made the call, reaching out to a legendary investigative journalist at the ** New York Times. A woman renowned for her fearless takedowns of corrupt politicians and corporate titans. The journalist, intrigued but wary, demanded an in-person meeting and irrefutable proof before she would even consider the story. As Owen compiled the evidence into a single encrypted digital folder, his eyes caught something he had missed before. On the corner of one of the vellum schematics, almost lost in the dense technical drawings, was a faint, handwritten annotation from Walter Sterling himself. It was a sequence of numbers followed by a single cryptic word, Raven. The word meant nothing to them, but in that moment, it felt like a final message from the past, another key to a lock they didn't even know existed. The meeting was set for a cold, rainy Tuesday night in November. They chose the Harold Washington Library Center, a vast, postmodern cathedral of knowledge, in the heart of downtown Chicago. The air inside was warm and thick, with the scent of wet wool, old paper, and the faint, ozonic hum of fluorescent lights. Rain lashed against the towering windows of the 9th-floor winter garden, the sound, a distant, rhythmic drumming that seemed to count down the seconds. The journalist, Sarah Jenkins, was already there, a woman in her late 40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She sat at a heavy oak table, a single notepad and pen laid out before her entire demeanor radiating a calm, professional skepticism that felt more intimidating than any overt hostility. The weight of their 19-year-old truth felt impossibly heavy in the echoing silence of the great room. Sarah greeted them with a firm handshake and a curt nod, her gaze moving from Owen's nervous energy to Clara's rigid composure and finally to Miller's weary resolve. She gestured for them to sit, her expression unreadable. "I get a dozen tips like this a month," she began, her voice a low, even tone that cut through the cavernous space. "Corporate malfeasance, old conspiracies, ghosts from the past. 99% of them are nothing but smoke." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking onto Owen. "You have my attention for 1 hour. The burden of proof is entirely on you. So show me the fire." The knot of anxiety in Owen's stomach tightened. He felt like a student standing before a master, the culmination of his entire accidental investigation about to be judged and potentially dismissed in a handful of minutes. Without a word, Owen opened his laptop and placed a pair of high-quality, noise-canceling headphones on the table. "You need to hear it exactly as we did," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah raised an eyebrow but complied, slipping the headphones over her ears. The ambient sounds of the library vanished for her, replaced by the faint hiss of aging magnetic tape. Owen clicked play. He, Clara, and Miller sat in absolute stillness, watching her face for any reaction as the passionate, desperate voice of Walter Sterling filled her ears, followed by the cold, pragmatic tones of Preston Blackwell. Her face remained a neutral mask, but Owen noticed her fingers, which had been resting calmly on her notepad, began to tap a restless, silent rhythm on the polished surface of the oak table. The seconds stretched into an eternity. When Preston Blackwell delivered his final chilling line, "and neither are you, the tapping stopped. Sarah's eyes, which had been analytical, narrowed with a new intensity. A flicker of something predatory crossed her features. She slowly removed the headphones, and the library's profound silence rushed back in to fill the void. She didn't speak for a long moment, simply staring at the laptop screen. Then she looked up, her gaze piercing. "The background hum," she stated, her voice sharp and certain. "The Arcmaster 3000. You have a sonic fingerprint that places Blackwell at a specific location, at a specific time, contradicting the official narrative. You have him at the scene. In that instant, the dynamic shifted. They were no longer just pitching a story. They had her. The first, most difficult wall had been breached. The evidence followed in a steady, undeniable cascade. Miller slid the notarized confession from Frank Rizzo across the table, the old security guard's trembling signature a testament to a lifetime of guilt. Clara followed with the financial documents, a complex web of shell corporations and offshore accounts that proved the theft of her father's gyroscopic technology and the birth of Blackwell Aerospace. The papers spread across the table, forming a chilling mosaic of greed, betrayal, and murder. Sarah Jenkins examined each document with methodical precision, her initial skepticism being visibly eroded, chiseled away piece by the sheer, overwhelming weight of the facts. This wasn't smoke. This was a raging multi-million-dollar inferno that had been smoldering for nearly 2 decades, and she was staring right into its heart. Finally, Owen presented the last piece of their puzzle, the high-resolution photograph of the vellum schematic, the elegant equations overshadowed by the cryptic, handwritten annotation in the corner. He pointed to the sequence of numbers and the single, baffling word, Raven. Sarah leaned in, studying the image. A project name? A component? She mused, the question hanging in the air. It was the one element that didn't connect, an outlier in their otherwise cohesive narrative. As she spoke, a sharp, percussive crack echoed from the far end of the vast reading room, the sound of a heavy encyclopedia being dropped flat onto a marble floor. The sudden noise shattered the quiet concentration, and all 4 of them jolted, their frayed nerves screaming. The illusion of safety and anonymity in the public library evaporated in a heartbeat. Miller's training kicked in instantly. His head snapped up, his eyes scanning the cavernous room, moving past the scattered students and readers. He saw him then, a man in a dark, tailored overcoat, standing in the deep shadows between 2 towering shelves of legal texts. He wasn't reading. He wasn't browsing. He was watching them with an unnerving stillness. A cold dread, familiar and bitter, settled in Miller's stomach. "We were followed," he whispered, his voice tight with urgency. "Don't look. Don't react." But it was too late. The man stepped out from the shadows and began walking toward their table, his polished shoes making no sound on the thick carpet. The vast, open space of the winter garden no longer felt like a sanctuary of knowledge. It felt like an arena, and they were the exposed, helpless prey. The man moved with a chilling, predatory grace, his face impassive, his eyes as cold and empty as a winter sky. He stopped 2 tables away, creating an unnerving bubble of personal space around them. His gaze lingered on Owen and Clara, a silent acknowledgement that he knew exactly who they were. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he reached inside his overcoat. For a heart-stopping second, Owen expected a weapon. Instead, the man produced a small, dark object and placed it reverently on the empty table between them. It was the original microcassette recorder, the one stolen from Owen's workshop. The gesture was a flagrant display of power, a silent boast that they could take anything they wanted, any time they wanted. It was a message of absolute control, delivered in the heart of the city's most public space. The fixer's performance wasn't over. He calmly took out his smartphone, tapped the screen, and held it up, angling it so they could all see. It was a live video feed, grainy but clear, from a camera aimed at a window. Owen recognized the building instantly, the St. Joseph's Care Facility. The camera zoomed in on a specific room where the frail, sleeping form of Frank Rizzo was visible, his oxygen tube glowing faintly in the dim light. The implication was as brutal as a physical blow. "We know every move you've made. We know who you talked to, and we can reach anyone, anywhere." The blood drained from Owen's face. This was Blackwell's answer to their investigation, a chillingly sophisticated act of intimidation that threatened not them, but the fragile, elderly man who held the key to their entire case. While Owen and Miller were paralyzed by the cold precision of the threat, something inside Clara snapped. All the pain, all the grief, All the years of feeling abandoned by her father were instantly transmuted into a white-hot, diamond-hard fury. The sight of the vulnerable old man, now a pawn in this monstrous game, was the final atrocity. She shot to her feet, the legs of her heavy oak chair screaming in protest against the marble floor. The sound echoed through the silent room, her eyes blazing with a righteous fire, locked with the fixer's emotionless stare. "You go back and you tell Preston," she said, her voice dangerously low and trembling not with fear, but with pure, unadulterated rage, "that my father's name was Walter Sterling, and he is going to hear it, see it, and read it until it is the last goddamn thing he ever knows." The fixer, for the first time, seemed to register an emotion, a flicker of surprise at her raw, defiant courage. He held her gaze for a long moment, then gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging a worthy opponent. He pocketed his phone, retrieved the microcassette recorder from the table, and with the same unnerving silence with which he had appeared, he turned and melted back into the shadows of the library stacks, leaving a profound and terrifying chill in his wake. The immediate danger had passed, but the encounter had irrevocably changed the stakes. Sarah Jenkins had witnessed it all, her pen frozen above her notepad. Her story was no longer about a 19-year-old crime. It was about a live, ongoing conspiracy, and she had just watched its violent, menacing arm reach into the present. As the adrenaline from the confrontation began to recede, Miller's mind, jolted into a state of high alert, suddenly forged a new connection. He stared at the photograph of the schematic, his eyes wide with a dawning realization. "Raven," he breathed, the word a sudden epiphany. Oh, God, it wasn't a project code. He fumbled for the tattered notebook he'd carried for decades, his fingers flying through the brittle, yellowed pages filled with his notes from 1992. He found the entry he was looking for. Raymond Vogel. He was a Chicago City zoning commissioner back then, a key signature on the Blackwell construction permits. His nickname inside City Hall was the Raven, because he had a reputation for collecting shiny things, bribes, kickbacks. He was one of the three who took an early, lavish retirement right after the tower was built. The final, devastating piece of the puzzle slammed into place with the force of a physical blow. The long string of numbers preceding the word Raven on Walter Sterling's schematic wasn't a serial number or a technical specification. It was an offshore bank account number. Walter hadn't just figured out that Blackwell was stealing his technology. He had uncovered the entire breadth of the conspiracy. He had found the proof of the bribes paid to the very city officials who would later fast-track the permits to build a skyscraper over his grave. The argument captured on that tiny tape was not a plea, it was a confrontation. It was Walter Sterling, armed with irrefutable evidence, making the fatal miscalculation of believing he could face down a monster and win. That was why he had to die. The heavy tool chest Frank Rizzo saw wasn't just hiding a body. It was hiding the foundation of an empire. The revelation hung in the air of the vast, silent library, a truth so sharp and absolute it seemed to suck the very oxygen from the room. The cryptic annotation on the schematic was no longer a mystery. It was a signed confession of a conspiracy. It was the motive, the method, and the cover-up, all laid bare by a dead man's hand. Sarah Jenkins, the journalist, looked at the evidence spread across the table. The audio file, the confession, the financial records, and now this final damning link, and her professional skepticism was replaced by a cold, righteous fury. She closed her notepad, the sound a decisive snap in the quiet. "Mr. Blackwell didn't just commit a murder," she said, her voice a low, steady hum of controlled anger. "He orchestrated a coup, and we are going to burn his kingdom to the ground." The story runs on the front page tonight. The article, titled "The Toymaker's Tomb, a 19-year-old Secret in the Foundation of a Chicago Empire," was published online at 2 a.m. It was a digital bombshell. Sarah Jenkins had woven every thread of their investigation into an undeniable tapestry of greed and violence. The piece opened with the sound of Walter Sterling's voice, the embedded audio file playing his final desperate argument. It included scanned copies of the aerospace schematics, the notarized confession of Frank Rizzo, and the financial trail leading to the Raven and his offshore account. The story didn't just report on a cold case. It presented the entire prosecution for the world to see. By dawn, it was the most read story in the nation. The narrative was irresistible. A beloved genius, a ruthless partner, a stolen invention, and a talking robot that held the key to a murder hidden in plain sight. The public reaction was immediate and explosive. The story went viral, dominating social media and every morning news broadcast. The image of the cheerful, cherry-red Sparky robot was juxtaposed with the cold, imposing facade of the Blackwell Toys headquarters, creating a powerful David and Goliath narrative. Protesters, many carrying vintage Sterling toys, began to gather outside the building, their numbers swelling throughout the day. The company's stock plummeted in pre-market trading, a freefall from which it would never recover. Preston Blackwell, the charismatic captain of industry, was instantly recast in the public consciousness as a modern-day monster, a man who had literally built his fortune on the bones of his friend. The city of Chicago, which had once celebrated him as a visionary, now looked upon him with collective horror and revulsion. Inside his penthouse office, Preston Blackwell watched his world disintegrate. The digital firestorm was unstoppable. Every news channel displaying his face next to the word murderer. His lawyers offered weak platitudes about libel and defamation, but he knew it was over. The evidence was too complete, too perfect. The confession from Rizzo, the schematics he thought were buried forever, the bank account he believed was untraceable. It was all there. He was a man trapped in a glass tower, watching an army he couldn't fight march upon his gates. The calm, calculating control that had defined his entire life finally shattered, replaced by a desperate, cornered rage. He had silenced Walter Sterling, but he had failed to account for the ghost in the machine, the mechanical witness that had waited patiently for 19 years to speak its truth. Under the crushing weight of public pressure and the undeniable evidence presented by the New York Times, the system was finally forced to act. The Cook County District Attorney's Office, in conjunction with the FBI, announced a full-scale joint investigation. Warrants were issued within hours. The first arrest was Raymond the Raven Vogel, apprehended by federal agents at his waterfront mansion in Naples, Florida. Faced with irrefutable proof of bribery and conspiracy to commit murder, Vogel's loyalty to Blackwell evaporated. He agreed to a full confession, corroborating every detail of the conspiracy in exchange for a reduced sentence. The first domino in Blackwell's corrupt network had fallen, and it was about to trigger a chain reaction that would bring the entire rotten structure crashing down. The arrest of Preston Blackwell was a media spectacle. A phalanx of police cars and FBI vehicles descended upon the Blackwell Toys headquarters, their sirens cutting through the chants of the protesters outside. He was led from his office in handcuffs, his impeccably tailored suit, a stark contrast to the cold steel on his wrists. The charismatic smile he had used to charm the world was gone, replaced by a tight-lipped mask of seething hatred. As he was pushed into the back of a police car, his eyes met Clara's in the crowd. For a fleeting moment, he saw not the woman she had become, but the 10-year-old girl whose father he had murdered. In her unwavering gaze, he saw his final, definitive defeat. The moment was captured by 100 cameras, a lasting image of justice delayed, but not denied. The subsequent investigation and trials were swift and decisive. Vogel's testimony blew the lid off decades of municipal corruption, leading to the indictment of 2 other former city officials and several of Blackwell's key corporate officers. The case against Blackwell himself was airtight. The prosecution used the digitally enhanced audio to place him at the scene of the crime, Frank Rizzo's videotaped deposition to establish the disposal of the body, and the vellum schematics to prove the multi-billion-dollar motive. The trial was a formality, a public airing of a crime that had already been solved. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a verdict, guilty on all counts, including first-degree murder, kidnapping, and multiple charges of financial racketeering. The monster had been caged. Preston Blackwell was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. destined to spend the rest of his days in a concrete cell, a fate grimly poetic for a man who had entombed his victim in the same material. His corporate empire crumbled. Blackwell Toys was dissolved, its assets seized and liquidated to pay massive civil damages to the Sterling estate. The most significant of these assets, Blackwell Aerospace, was taken over by the U.S. government, its stolen technology finally serving the nation rather than the greed of a single man. The name Blackwell, once a symbol of Chicago business prowess, was now a permanent stain on the city's history, a cautionary tale of ambition curdled into pure evil. Months later, Clara Sterling stood before the gaping hole in the Chicago skyline where the Blackwell Tower once stood. After the bankruptcy, the building had been declared a crime scene and, ultimately, a tomb. Forensic teams had excavated the central foundation column, recovering the corroded remains of a steel tool chest and, within it, the last physical traces of her father. He was given a proper burial, a final, quiet ceremony under a tall oak tree next to his wife. Standing on the barren ground, Clara felt a profound, aching peace. The ghost of abandonment that had haunted her for 2 decades was finally gone, replaced by the truth of a father who had not left her, but had been stolen from her. The pain of his loss remained, but it was now a clean wound, free of the poison of lies. Owen Hayes found his own peace back in the quiet sanctuary of his workshop. He had been hailed as a hero, but the attention was uncomfortable. He was, at his core, a restorer, a man who preferred the company of the past. One afternoon, a package arrived. It was from Clara. Inside was an old, ornate brass key and a simple, handwritten note. The key was to her father's personal workshop at their family home in Oak Park, a space that had been sealed since the day he disappeared. The note read, "I think he would want a fellow artist to be the first one to see it. Thank you for giving me my father back." Owen held the key in his hand, a tangible link to the man who had been his hero long before he became his cause. The Sparky prototype found its final home not on a collector's shelf, but in a climate-controlled glass case of the Chicago History Museum. It became the centerpiece of a new exhibit titled The Genius of Walter Sterling. The display told the full story, from his whimsical early creations to the revolutionary technology he died to protect. Sparky stood proudly, its cheerful painted smile no longer a mask for a dark secret, but a symbol of resilience. It was a testament to the idea that, even in the darkest of stories, a small spark of truth can survive, waiting patiently in the dark to be found. It was no longer just a toy. It was an icon of justice, a silent hero that had finally been given a voice after 19 years of waiting. A week later, Owen used the key. He stepped into Walter Sterling's workshop, and it was like stepping back in time. The air still held the faint scent of sawdust and machine oil. Half-finished toys sat on workbenches, tools were laid out as if waiting for their master to return, and whimsical blueprints covered every wall. It was a perfect, heartbreaking diorama of a creative life cut short. Owen walked through the space with a quiet reverence, a student finally admitted to the master's studio. It was a place of pure, unadulterated wonder, a world away from the greed and violence that had ended its creator's life. He felt an overwhelming sense of connection, a final, quiet communion with the spirit of Walter Sterling. On the main workbench, nestled amongst calipers and gears, was a small silver picture frame. It held a faded photograph of a smiling 10-year-old Clara, perched happily on her father's shoulders. Tucked carefully into the corner of the frame was a small, folded piece of paper. Owen gently removed it and unfolded it. It was a note, written in Walter's elegant, looping script. "For my brightest star," it read. "No matter what I build, no matter what I invent, my greatest creation will always be the joy in your eyes. Love, Dad." In that quiet, dusty room, Owen understood the ultimate truth of the story. The real treasure Preston Blackwell had stolen wasn't a billion-dollar technology. It was this. It was the simple, irreplaceable love of a father for his daughter, a love that had finally, after so long, found its way home. Owen stood in the reverent silence of the workshop. the small, folded note a fragile weight in his palm. He looked from the elegant script to the half-finished creations surrounding him, each a testament to a mind that saw the world not as it was, but as it could be. It was a place of profound contradiction, where the purest form of creative joy had given birth to a technology so powerful it had inspired the darkest form of human greed. The genius that could animate a tin soldier was the same genius that could guide a missile, and Walter Sterling had been destroyed at the intersection of those two realities. The note, however, was the final word in that conflict. It was proof that, for its creator, the ultimate purpose of his gift was never power or profit, but the simple, immeasurable value of a child's smile. The true legacy of Walter Sterling, Owen realized, was not entombed in a concrete foundation or locked away in a government vault. It lived in the memories of a generation who grew up with his toys, in the DNA of every designer he inspired, including Owen himself. Preston Blackwell had stolen an invention, a corporation, and a life, but he could never touch the wonder. That was Walter's real, indestructible empire. It was an inheritance of imagination, passed down not through stock certificates or patent filings, but through the shared experience of childhood magic. It was the quiet, persistent hum of creativity that echoed in this workshop, a force far more enduring than the cold, hard logic of the billion-dollar industry built upon its creator's demise. Blackwell had taken the machine, but he had missed the ghost entirely. Miles away, in the hushed halls of the Chicago History Museum, Sparky stood as the silent, gleaming heart of that legacy. No longer a dusty relic on an auction block, it was now a priceless artifact, its cherry-red paint and cheerful smile imbued with a story that had captivated the world. It was a monument to the quiet resilience of truth. For 19 years it had held its secret, a mechanical sarcophagus guarding a voice from the past. Now it served as a permanent reminder that no crime, no matter how carefully planned or deeply buried, is ever truly perfect. It was a symbol of justice delivered from the most unlikely of places, proving that sometimes the smallest key can unlock the largest, most heavily guarded door, and that even a simple toy can become an instrument of profound and lasting consequence. Clara Sterling found her own way to honor that legacy. After the trials concluded, she established the Walter Sterling Foundation for Artistic Innovation, funded by the massive civil settlement from Blackwell's liquidated assets. The foundation provided grants to young artists, engineers, and inventors, who, like her father, were driven by a passion for creating things of wonder and joy, with no expectation of commercial return. She transformed her grief into a powerful engine for good, ensuring her father's spirit of pure, unadulterated creativity would continue to thrive, sponsoring a new generation of dreamers. The Foundation's motto, etched on a brass plaque at its entrance, was a line taken directly from the note found in the workshop. "My greatest creation will always be the joy in your eyes." Owen Hayes returned to his own workshop, but the space felt different, imbued with a new sense of purpose. He continued his work as a restorer, but he no longer saw just gears and springs. He saw the stories, the intentions, and the fragments of the creators, souls left behind in their work. The quiet, solitary man who had stumbled into a 19-year-old mystery had become a keeper of history, a detective of inanimate objects. He understood now that his passion was not simply for the toys themselves, but for the human stories they contained. He was a guardian of small, forgotten truths, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that Sparky would not be the last ghost to speak to him from the silent, mechanical past. The fall of Preston Blackwell sent a seismic shockwave through the city of Chicago, toppling a corrupt network that had festered in the shadows for decades. The Toymaker's Tomb scandal, as it came to be known, triggered sweeping reforms in municipal government and corporate oversight. A painful but necessary cleansing of a system that had allowed a man like Blackwell to flourish. The story became a legend, a piece of modern folklore whispered in the city's boardrooms and classrooms alike. It served as a stark, enduring lesson that empires built on foundations of lies are destined to crumble, and that sometimes the most powerful force for justice isn't an army or a police force, but a single, determined person who simply refuses to let a story die. In the end, it was a story about the nature of secrets. Some are buried under thousands of tons of concrete and steel, hidden from the world by power and influence. Others are hidden in plain sight, tucked away in the battery compartment of a forgotten toy, waiting for a curious hand and a listening ear. The 19-year journey of Walter Sterling's last words proved that both kinds of secrets are ultimately fragile. It affirmed that the past is never truly past. It is a living, breathing entity that leaves echoes in the most unexpected places. It is a reminder to look closer, to listen to the silence between the noise, for every object we touch holds a history, and some are just waiting for the right moment to tell their tale. Owen gently placed the small, handwritten note back into the corner of the silver picture frame, returning it to its place on the workbench beside the photograph of a smiling father and his adoring daughter. He took one last look around the dusty, magical room, a perfect time capsule of a life's work, a testament to a love that had outlasted death and betrayal. He switched off the single lamp hanging over the bench, plunging the workshop into a soft, respectful darkness. For in the end, it wasn't $1 billion technology that brought down an empire. It was the simple, undeniable power of a father's love, hidden inside a tin plate robot, that had waited for 19 years to finally find its way home. The story of Sparky and Walter Sterling was a closed chapter, but the book of secrets it opened was far from finished. The threads of corruption they had pulled on led to other doors, other cold cases, and other powerful figures who had operated in the dark for far too long. What other truths are hiding just beneath the surface of our everyday lives, waiting for a single, accidental discovery to bring them into the light? If this story has moved you, please support our channel by liking, sharing, and subscribing with all notifications turned on. Your support allows us to keep digging. Let us know in the comments what you think is the most powerful secret a person can keep. And this was just the beginning of something much bigger.